Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are looking at the ultimate paradox that both believers and atheists have wrestled with for millennia. I mean, if there is a good God or even just a rational universe, where does all this profound suffering come from? From an ancient cosmic prosecuting attorney to child sacrifices in the Valley of Hinnom to terrifying exorcisms and winged beasts in the forests of New Jersey, we are tracing the evolution of humanity's ultimate villain. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a fascinating stack of sources, including deep biblical scholarship and historical accounts of the paranormal, to discover how evil went from a simple job title to a terrifying physical reality. And real quick, before we jump into all this heavy material, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep unpacking these massive topics for you.
It does. And, it really is an incredible journey we're taking you on today because regardless of whether you approach these ancient texts as like divine revelation from a spiritual realm, or if you look at them purely as a fascinating psychological history of human coping mechanisms, the evolution of the devil is quite literally one of the most astonishing detective stories hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a story about how humanity attempts to categorize the darkness in the world, and it forces us to look right at that fault line where theology and atheism collide.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to find the origin of the ultimate bad guy, we logically have to go back to the very beginning, right?
Right.
Genesis, the Garden of Eden. The serpent who tricks Eve introduces death to the world and just ruins absolute paradise. We all know who that is. Culturally, we are taught as Satan.
Exactly.
Except, according to the deep dive into the historical sources we're looking at today, the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 is never called Satan.
No.
Not a single time. But the sources do point out a massive sort of aha moment in the original Hebrew text that totally changes how you read it.
That's right, yeah. And it has to do with the original Hebrew word used for the serpent, which is nachash. So in the ancient Near East, nachash functioned essentially as a linguistic triple entendre.
Wait, a triple entendre? Like it meant three different things at once?
Exactly. It can translate literally to serpent, sure, but the root of the word also translates to enchanter or diviner, and it can even mean the shining one.
The shining one.
Yeah. So to the ancient reader, this wasn't just, a talking garden snake. This was a luminous, potentially angelic being in rebellion. It sets the stage for a cosmic conflict. But you are entirely correct. The text does not use the word Satan here, nor does it appear as a proper name anywhere in the early Hebrew Bible.
Which is just wild to me. Because we assume the name was there from day one. But if it's not a name, what is it?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the Hebrew linguistics of the word we translate as Satan, which is ha-Satan. Now, in Hebrew, just like in English, you do not put a definite article, the word the, in front of a proper personal name.
Right. You wouldn't introduce yourself as the John or the Sarah.
Exactly. So ha-Satan translates literally to the Satan. It means the adversary, the obstructor, or the accuser. It's a function. It's a role.
Oh, I see. So if we look at the book of Job, which is one of the oldest texts in the Bible, the Satan is actually part of God's divine counsel. He's a spiritual being whose literal job description is to patrol the earth, observe humanity, and report back.
Yes, he acts as a challenger.
Right. When God points out how righteous Job is, the adversary pushes back and says, well, does Job fear God for no reason? You give him everything, take away his stuff, and he will curse you to your face.
And notice the dynamic there. He is not rebelling against God's authority in that moment.
Yeah.
He is actively participating in the heavenly court system.
Think of him less like an evil mastermind and more like God's director of internal affairs.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, his job isn't to be evil. His job is to test the loyalty of the staff. He's the guy who sends the fake phishing emails to the company to see who clicks on them.
That is a perfect analogy.
But wait, I have to push back here. Because if he's basically just a middle manager with an attitude problem, just patrolling the earth and filing performance reports, how did he become the ultimate villain? How do we go from a celestial prosecutor to the prince of darkness with a pitchfork?
What's fascinating here is that the shift doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because of profound human trauma, and it forces a complete rewriting of how humanity understood suffering.
Okay, trauma. Tell me more.
So to see this transition, we have to look at a massive textual contradiction in the Hebrew Bible. There's a story about King David taking a census of Israel, which was considered a sign of pride and a lack of trust in divine protection.
Right.
In the older text, 2 Samuel 24, it explicitly says that the anger of the Lord was kindled, and God incited David to take the census.
Which is a huge problem, right?
Yeah.
Because David takes the census, God gets angry at the census
That's
she
true.
just incited, and the punishment is a plague that kills 70,000 Israelites.
Exactly.
God essentially causes the sin and then punishes the people for it.
The theological implications are staggering, but then the exact same historical event is retold in a later text, 1 Chronicles 21, and in this much later version, the text says Satan stood up against Israel and incited David. Same historical event, completely different culprit.
Wow. And this is exactly where atheists and theists have some of their most intense, fiery debates today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you're looking at this from a secular atheistic perspective, you look at those two texts and say, look, humans just rewrote their theology to get God off the hook. It's ancient PR.
Right. Theodicy?
Exactly. You can't have a benevolent God causing a plague, so you invent a scapegoat. But if you're a believer reading those same texts, you see this as progressive revelation. That God was slowly revealing the true nature of a separate spiritual adversary over centuries, only giving humanity as much cosmic truth as they were ready to handle.
Yes.
Now, obviously, we aren't taking science here, but it is a massive ideological crossroads for you listening to ponder.
And it's a crossroads born out of the catastrophic trauma of the Babylonian Exile, around 586 BC.
Ah, so that's the trauma you mentioned.
Exactly. Imagine you are an Israelite living in that era. Before the exile, your theology dictated that God caused absolutely everything, both the good and the evil.
Yeah, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 45 literally says, I form light and create darkness, I create calamity.
Precisely. But then the Babylonian Empire arrives. They lay siege to Jerusalem, people starve, the city is burned to the ground.
It's just complete devastation.
Total devastation. The sacred temple, the literal dwelling place of God on earth, is completely destroyed, and the population is dragged away in chains.
When you are sitting in the smoldering ashes of your entire civilization, that old theology of God causes the calamity become suffocating. I mean, it breaks the mind.
It does.
How can a loving, perfectly good God be the direct, active author of such horrific, absolute evil?
That is the problem of evil, the ultimate crisis of faith. How do you maintain trust in a good universe when the world is literally burning? So the Jewish scribes, reeling from this devastation and exile, went back to their scriptures.
Right.
And many secular historians argue they didn't just borrow the concept of a devil from the Persians or Zoroastrianism, as is sometimes assumed. They reread their own texts.
Okay.
They began connecting the dots of various spiritual rebellions, like the Nachash in Eden and the Adversary in Job. And in 1 Chronicles, written after this trauma, for the very first time in the text, the word Satan appears without the art.
Oh, the definite article drops.
Exactly.
It's no longer a job title. It becomes a proper name.
The cosmic adversary becomes personalized. Evil is given an independent face.
Okay, so humanity establishes this singular cosmic scapegoat to explain the horrors of the world, solving that theological crisis. But once that door is open, the concept just explodes. Because suddenly, this adversary is everywhere, taking on all sorts of local identities to explain why everything is going wrong.
Yes, during what historians call the Second Temple period, basically the chaotic few centuries right before the Roman Empire takes over and the New Testament begins, the Jewish people were constantly being conquered by the Greeks, the Syrians, and eventually the Romans.
It never stopped.
No, it didn't. To cope with this endless suffering, there is a massive explosion of apocalyptic literature. Think of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, right.
In these texts, communities start giving this adversary different names to highlight specific aspects of his evil.
Our sources highlight some wild variations. I mean, there's Mastema, who in the Book of Jubilees actually takes the blame for a really bizarre, archaic story in Exodus where God seemingly tries to kill Moses in the middle of the night.
Right, yeah.
The later writers basically step in and say, wait, no, that wasn't God, that was Mastema.
Correct.
There's Belial, who the Essene community viewed as the Prince of Darkness, locked in a literal impending cosmic war against the sons of light. And my personal favorite example of this evolution, Beelzebub.
Yes. Beelzebub is a brilliant example of cultural warfare through language.
Yeah.
The rival Canaanites worshipped a god named Baal-Zabul, which translates to Baal the Prince. The Israelites mockingly changed one letter to make it Baal-Zebub, which means Lord of the Flies.
Which is such a visceral insult. I mean, you're associating a rival civilization's supreme deity with rotting meat, decay, and swarming insects. They were actively demonizing their neighbors' beliefs.
They really were.
But it's vital to point out that this externalization of evil isn't just a Judeo-Christian phenomenon. Our sources show this is a global, cross-cultural reflex.
Oh, absolutely.
In Buddhism, you have Mara, a demonic entity representing destruction and temptation, who tries to stop the Buddha from achieving enlightenment. In Islam, you have Iblis, a jinn who refuses to bow to humanity and becomes the ultimate tempter. Humans across the globe fundamentally needed a face for the darkness.
However, we have to look at the profound psychological and physical toll of that belief. When you convince a population that evil is not just a concept, but an active, literal demon in the sky who controls the rain and the crops, a bad harvest isn't just bad luck.
Right.
It's a cosmic threat that demands a terrifying ransom.
And that bridges us to something genuinely horrific in the historical record.
Yeah.
The Valley of Hinnom. It's a literal physical valley just outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem. Today, the Hebrew word for this valley, Gehenna, is actually the word used for hell.
Yeah.
And the reason why is deeply unsettling.
It is. The ancient peoples living there were so profoundly paralyzed by the fear of these dark demonic forces that they engaged in literal child sacrifice.
Unbelievable.
They built massive fire pits in this valley to the Canaanite god Molech.
To ensure the rains would come and the demons wouldn't destroy their city, they threw their own firstborn sons into the fire.
It's horrifying.
It is just a staggering, tragic realization of what happens when absolute terror takes hold of a culture. I mean, it was an act that God explicitly and angrily condemned in the book of Jeremiah, demanding it to stop. But it shows the raw, desperate grip that the concept of an active, evil force held over the ancient mind.
It serves as a stark warning. When evil becomes a physical, external entity in the human mind, our physical reactions to it can become unspeakably horrific.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If the biblical texts originally describe this adversary as an invisible spirit in a divine council, or a luminous angelic shining one, why do you and I collectively picture a red monster with horns and a pitchfork?
That's a great question.
And even crazier, why do people claim to see literal monsters in the woods today?
Well, the visual evolution of Satan as a horned beast is almost entirely unbiblical. It's a product of medieval Christian artists trying to visually communicate theology to a population of peasants who largely couldn't read.
Right, visual storytelling.
Exactly. To stop people from worshiping the old pagan gods of Europe, the church brilliantly and ruthlessly demonized them. Literally.
Wait, so by painting pagan gods as literal monsters on church walls, they basically ran a medieval propaganda campaign.
Yes.
They didn't just tell the peasants Pan was a fake myth, they told them he was actively hunting them.
That is the exact psychological mechanism at play. They took Pan, the Greek god of nature who had goat hooves and horns, and said, that is what a demon looks like. They took Hades, or Pluto, the underworld gods who carried a two-pronged spear for moving souls, and that becomes the devil's pitchfork. You mix that pagan imagery with Dante's Inferno in the 1300s, which vividly detailed a terrifying, monstrous ruler of hell, and you get the cultural shorthand for the devil. Red skin for the fire of hell, bat wings, horns, and hooves. It's a Frankenstein amalgamation of discarded gods.
But I have to push back on the idea that this cultural imagination just stayed safely painted on stained glass windows or in epic poems. Because when you embed the idea of a physical winged monster into a culture's DNA, it travels with them, and it births real-world hysteria. Case in point, the Jersey Devil.
Ah, yes. The Jersey Devil is a perfect case study of how imported medieval fears manifest in isolated, vulnerable communities.
Yeah. Deep in the pine barrens of New Jersey, which, by the way, is 1 million acres of dense, dark, isolated woods, there's this legend. Born in 1735, supposedly the cursed 13th child of a woman named Mother Leeds. The story goes she yelled, "Let the devil take him," during birth, and the baby transformed into a grotesque monster. A horse's head, bat wings, a kangaroo-like body, and a forked tail. It sounds ridiculous on paper.
It does.
But you have Commodore Stephen Decatur, a highly respected, deeply serious naval war hero in the early 1800s who claimed he saw it flying overhead while testing cannonballs and fired a literal shot straight through its wing.
The isolation of the Pine Barrens is key here.
For sure.
When early colonists, steeped in this European folklore of demons and witches, found themselves in a vast, terrifying wilderness they didn't understand, their minds projected those inherited fears right into the shadows.
And it caused real panic.
Yeah.
In 1909, there were hundreds of sightings in a single week. It shut down schools, it closed businesses, armed posses were roaming the woods. A trolley car in Hayden Heights was supposedly dive-bombed by it.
That's incredible.
The hysteria was entirely real to them. And to add one more layer, long before the colonists even arrived, the native Lenape tribe referred to the Pine Barrens as the place of the dragon.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? It's not just creatures in the woods we project this fear onto, it's the landscape itself.
What do you mean?
When early settler or indigenous peoples encountered geography that defied logic, they often attributed it to the supernatural. Take Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Oh, right. This colossal 900-foot shaft of volcanic rock just bursting out of the totally flat plains.
Exactly. Geologists theorize it's made of magma that cooled underground and was exposed by erosion, but its sheer, abrupt presence feels almost unnatural.
Yeah, it looks like someone placed it there.
Right. Native American tribes have long viewed it as a highly sacred altar, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersect. And of course, Hollywood seized on this mysterious energy for the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, portraying it as a landing site for UFOs. We look at a geological anomaly, and our instinct is to associate it with forces far beyond our control, be it gods, devils, or aliens.
It's the constant friction between what we can mathematically measure and what we viscerally experience. And nowhere is that friction more intense today than on the modern front line of this cosmic war. Exorcisms.
Yes.
This isn't just ancient history or folklore. In 2013, Pope Francis was filmed in St. Peter's Square, laying his hands on a man and reciting a prayer of exorcism.
That's right.
The Vatican still formally trains exorcists today.
They do. And the accounts from these modern exorcists are deeply unsettling because they defy our modern understanding of physics and psychiatry. We like to think science has explained away the demons of the ancient world, but these trained professionals report phenomena that they claim are entirely unexplainable by any natural law.
Right.
They describe a very distinct, unforgettable look of evil in the eyes of the possessed, a sudden fluency in ancient languages the person has never studied, and impossible strength.
I was reading the case files in our sources, and they are chilling. An exorcist reported a 110-pound woman easily throwing 3 grown men across a room without breaking a sweat.
It's terrifying.
And then there's levitation. These aren't superstitious peasants from the Dark Ages reporting this. These are modern priests dealing with doctors, lawyers, and military personnel, claiming to witness people floating in midair. They argue with absolute conviction that dark spiritual forces can and do violate the normal laws of gravity and nature.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how thin the veil might actually be.
It really does. But what is perhaps most compelling and practically relevant for our listeners about the modern practice of exorcism is how it intersects with psychology. Exorcists note that they usually have to heal on 2 tracks simultaneously, the spiritual and the psychological.
That's the part that really stuck with me. The exorcists explicitly state that demonic forces don't just possess people randomly.
No, they don't.
They feed off internal wounds, unprocessed trauma, deep-seated anger, intense unforgiveness.
Exactly.
So to banish the spiritual evil, the priest actually has to help the person process their psychological trauma. When the inner emotional wounds heal, the demonic entity has nothing left to grip onto. It's a fascinating synthesis.
It is.
The ancient spiritual war is actually being fought on the battlefield of modern mental health.
Which brings us full circle to how humanity processes pain and evil, both on a grand cosmic scale and a deeply personal, internal one.
So what does this all mean? We started with a missing name in Genesis and ended up with levitating professionals.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. And if we look at the whole picture, the concept of Satan evolved remarkably. It started with that fascinating Hebrew linguistic pun in Genesis, the Nachash, a luminous enchanter. It functioned as a cosmic director of internal affairs testing humanity's loyalty.
Right.
Then it was crystallized by the horrific trauma of the Babylonian Exile into a personalized scapegoat before finally absorbing the terrifying imagery of pagan gods to become the ultimate king of the underworld. And why him? Because his rebellion in Eden introduced the one thing every single human being inevitably faces and fears the most: death.
And that leaves us with a profound final thought for you to consider.
Let's hear it.
If human beings are entirely alone in the universe, if there are no literal demons, no ancient shining serpents, and no spiritual adversaries patrolling the earth testing our faith, then our capacity to invent a creature of pure, unadulterated evil implies a terrifying truth about the depths of our own psychology.
Oh, wow.
We have to ask ourselves, are we creating the devil to explain the inexplicable darkness of the world around us, or are we creating him so we don't have to look at the darkness inside ourselves?
It really makes you reconsider that opening paradox. When you're looking for the source of all the profound suffering in the world, maybe the scariest thing isn't finding a cosmic prosecuting attorney or a monster in the Pine Barrens. Maybe the scariest thing is realizing that the ultimate villain has been wearing a human face the entire time.